make the task smaller. If you make the task small enough, I've never seen anyone not be able to progress if they made the task small enough. But, that can be pretty humiliating. Now, the upside is that once you take that first step, you've looked the beast in the face and you'll start progressing, not linearly, but exponentially in speed. So what's cool is that it doesn't really matter how small that first step is because it'll start doubling, and anything that doubles grows unbelievably quickly. And so that's a very useful thing to know too. And that's true when you're learning anything new. It's like you'll feel like an imposter, you'll feel like a fool because you are, and you'll think, I'll never get there, and the destination might look very distant, but if you take a sufficiently small first step and get the ball rolling, you can be cruising along at a pretty good rate, generally faster than you'll think.
What's going on in one's psychology there? Is it building evidence of your own capabilities and capacity?
Definitely. What seems to happen when you expose people to small but challenging tasks, it does two things. It makes them more skilled because now they're actually dealing with the problem. And so they're acquiring the new perceptions and the new behaviors that are mastery. So they're actually expanding their domain of conceptual structures and actions. That's both conception and skill. But at the same time, they're seeing themselves as the actors that can change the direction of their life. For example, when you do exposure therapy with people who have phobias, agoraphobia is probably the best example. So agoraphobia is a condition where people will become so terrified generally of life that they often literally can't go outside their house. If they go outside their house, their anxiety levels climb to the point where they have a panic attack, which is like the complete disinhibition of the fight or flight system. Very overwhelming experience. People will go out and they'll have a panic attack, and then they'll avoid where they had the panic attack. But then the probability of the panic attack starts to spread so that wherever they go, they have a panic attack, and then they end up stuck at home. And it's quite a common condition. Now, the people who develop that are generally women, and that's because women are more sensitive to anxiety than men. They're generally women who had an over-dependent relationship with their parents, maybe particularly their father. They're generally women who went from their father to a boyfriend who was either overbearing and overprotective, or who was enticed into becoming that by the dependency of the person, of the sufferer. And then, so imagine you're a dependent young woman, you haven't learned to stand on your 2 feet. Every time you had a problem, you were taught to seek authority. You sheltered behind the protective walls that someone else had established for you. You married someone like that. Now he died, or you're getting a divorce, or so that wall is starting to come down. Okay, so all that existential panic starts to rise. You start panicking when you go out, and you end up at home unable to move. Also thinking you're the only person in the world who's suffering that way. And so what you do is you find out, you do a problem analysis, and you find out their core fears. And agoraphobics are often afraid of elevators. And that's quite convenient because, there are elevators everywhere. So you can start having them confront their fear of elevators. So how do you do that? Well, if they're really terrified, you say, well, let's look, why don't you come sit by me and let's look at some pictures of some elevators. And you say, look at the elevator. Okay, now imagine being 20 feet from it. How are you feeling? And they'll tell you. They're nervous, they're afraid they're going to get trapped in the elevator. They're afraid they'll have a heart attack. They're afraid that they'll be in there with other people who are watching them panic and have a heart attack and being humiliated. So the two big categories of fears for people are like painful death and then public humiliation. And if you have a really good anxiety fantasy, it's that you're going to undergo a painful death in a very humiliating way. And so that's what they imagine happening in the elevator. So it's not exactly that they're afraid of the elevator, right? They're afraid of death and humiliation. And the elevator is a portal to the realm of death and humiliation. It's like, I'm afraid of an elevator. Okay, how afraid? Could you look at an elevator from 100 yards down the hall? Well, like, if it isn't 100 yards, then 125 yards. Like, you'll find some threshold that the person can tolerate. Okay, so now you're at the threshold where the magnitude of their confidence is precisely matched with the size of the apparent dragon, right? So, and they feel that. It's like there's a place where their fear they'll say, that's close enough. It's like, okay, now you're on the edge. You're on the edge. So now we'll dance on the edge. We'll move you a foot forward. Okay, so let's move a foot forward. Okay, anything negative happening? Well, I'm feeling a little nervous. Okay, well, let's just stand here for a bit. Keep your eye on the elevator. Don't hide, because you can avoid by just not looking. And we do this all the time. We look away, and the bigger the dragon, the more we're likely to look away. You know, people don't like to look at, and you can understand why. People will avert their eyes from atrocity, right? And they'll certainly avert their eyes from the thought that they could participate in atrocity. And you could think of that as the heart of darkness. It isn't, because you could look at the fact that you could take glee in the commission of atrocity. And no one wants to look at that. Well, you start, and you have to look at that. You have to look at that in the final analysis. But one step at a time, you know, and you can do that with any problem, literally any problem. Break it down, break it down, break it down.
Public speaking.
Anything.
Going to the gym. Yeah.
Anything. A small dose. You know, a small dose. And it's so fun to do this with people. It's the same thing you do when you're encouraging your young child. And that's a primary source of gratification for human beings, is putting someone on the edge and encouraging them. And so you do that as a clinician. So I loved being a clinician because, people say, well, how can you, how do you tolerate listening to people's problems? Well, first of all, they're not your problems. You have to understand that. Because if they're your problems, you're stealing that person's problems from them. Because you could come to me, especially people who are, very unsophisticated. They can come and talk to somebody like a well-experienced clinician, someone whose breadth of knowledge exceeds theirs by a substantial margin, and that person can just give them advice. But then they go act out that advice, and then that's not them. They have to come to it themselves.
This brings me to a point about trying to help people in your life, because we all have people in our lives that are struggling in some way, and our knee-jerk response is to get in there and fix
solve
it.
the problem. Yeah, and this is a problem that men often have when they're dealing with women.
Yeah.
They leap to the problem solution phase. And they also do that in some ways to avoid, and this is what annoys women, because what the women want, and they don't even know this, but this is what the women want. Women are more sensitive to threat than men. Okay, so they're looking for predators. Now, predation detection it's an intuition. Anxiety is an intuition. Something's wrong. Okay, what? Well, then you guess, right? So imagine the threat system has sort of got something in its sights, but it's a sense that something's not right. But it's not fully fleshed out, the picture, because serpents are camouflaged, right? So the threat is hidden. Well, what the woman wants is to lay out all the things that might be wrong. Okay, well, the guy doesn't want that because, first of all, maybe your wife is upset about something in relationship to your children, and she doesn't know what it is. So now she has to go through everything she thinks that might be wrong. Well, even for you to listen, that's going to be rough because some of those things are going to be about you. And so you just have to shut up and you have to let her put her cards on the table. Understanding. Now, she has to do it in good faith, right? She can't be using that opportunity to skewer you. And so these things are tricky to manage, but you want to listen to her, lay all the cards on the table. Now, the advantage to that is now you know where all the hidden snakes are. Now, if you do that, what you'll find out, and so will she, is that most of the things that she's worried about, she's not actually worried about. She won't know that until she lays them out on the table and can see them. And then both of you can triangulate to the actual problem, and then you can negotiate a solution and offer help. But if you jump right to help, the reason you can't do that is because you probably have the problem wrong. So then back to your question about helping. One of the most effective things you can do to help people is to listen. And there are technologies of listening. And so the first one is Don't assume that either you or the person who's talking knows what the problem is. It's so hard. Once you have the problem specified, you've solved like 95% of the problem. That diagnostic move is really hard. Are we sure we're addressing the most crucial issue? You have to have your sights focused right on the center point of the cross, right? Like in a gun sight. It's like, are we aiming at the right target? And then you can start negotiating problem solution. And but you can develop the patience to do that once you understand that initial act of listening is in itself the most helpful thing you can do. Just listen. And then how do you listen? Okay, so if I'm listening to you, there'll be times when what you're saying doesn't make sense. And so then I'll just say, well, you're saying this now, but you said this 5 minutes ago. And if you listen a lot, you can learn to track conversations across a very long span of time. And that's quite fun. You said this, but then you said this, and they seem contradictory to me. You're not accusing the person. You're saying, I see an inconsistency in the way you're formulating the problem. And they'll sort of startle a little bit and then try to rectify that. They'll check you out to see if you're insulting them or trying to play a game of moral superiority first. But if it's just an honest question, then you're actually helping them lay out a description of the situation that's not internally contradictory. Okay, so, and the great podcasters do this. You see this with Rogan. All Rogan does is ask stupid questions. And the way he does that is by consulting with his own ignorance in humility. Rogan is listening. He's thinking, I'm a stupid lunkhead and I don't understand this. What do you mean? And that's brave because he's exposing his own ignorance, but it's honest because he doesn't understand, but it also unites him with his audience because, especially with someone like Rogan, the probability at this time that if Rogan doesn't understand the gist of the conversation, that 95% of his audience doesn't understand it's like 100%. The importance of listening can't possibly be overstated. Listen, ask questions until you understand.